All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Here we are in psychology for Unit 3, and we're talking a little bit about infancy and childhood. This will be the first in a number of lessons on developmental psychology, where we're looking at kind of the stages of life and what the individual goes through in terms of development, both physical and cognitive, or in terms of the brain process, as they're moving from infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood. So we'll start off with infancy and childhood and go through some information there. And by the time you're done with this, you'll be ready to do your assessment based on your reading at the end of Lesson 3. So let's go ahead, as we have done in the past, and spotlight a particular psychological issue. And this time we're going to be talking about something called Capgras delusion. So the psychological issue is Capgras delusion. And this is a very interesting one. This is, remember last week we talked about the Paris syndrome, where the Japanese tourists were having problems with Paris and the fact that their image of Paris in their mind was different than the reality. This is also a situation where reality has changed for someone. And in the Capgras delusion, what's going on is that the person that's afflicted believes that a close family member or a close friend has been replaced by an identical looking imposter. So their husband, their son, their daughter, their mom, their dad is not actually that person, but is an imposter who is exactly, takes on the same characteristics as the original person. This is a form of schizophrenia, which is a disease that we'll touch on a lot more as we go, and also tends to be something that pops up in people that have had traumatic brain injury. So if there's been some sort of a major brain injury due to an accident or something of that sort, we often see this popping up. There's been movies that have been based on this kind of concept. There's one from way back in the 50s or 60s called Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and then they redid that one in the, I think, 80s or 90s. Total Recall, same kind of idea. So there's a number of movies based on this concept, but this is an actual delusion. This is what people go through when they look at their close friend. They don't believe it's them. They think it's an imposter, and obviously that can lead to a number of big problems. All right, getting back to the topic at hand, we're going to start our unit on infants and children, really talking about developmental psychology. And developmental psychology is the subset of psychology where we're looking at, not shockingly, the development of people. And so in certain stages, and we'll talk more about that. In the first stages, one of the critical things that psychologists have been looking at for a long time is the concept of nature versus nurture. And what that means is people are wondering what is actually the thing that has the greatest impact on the development of a young person, of an infant and a child. Is it the genetics of the parents? So, you are predetermined to be very much like your parents because they're the ones that are providing you with the genetic code that's making you up as a person. Or is it more of your environment, what you're learning, what's going on in the world around you? And that would be called the nurtures phase. So is it one or is it the other, or is it a combination of both? And most people believe it's a combination of both. You are who you are through not only who you were born to be through your genetics, but also how you grew up. And a number of studies have been done to show this. So usually what the classic study is twins. Twins that have the same, obviously, genetics, have the same parents, have the same beginning of life that might have been separated. How are they different? How are they the same? And there's ways that you can see, okay, well, the environment of this particular person has impacted them differently than the environment here, but there's also some similarities based on the genetics. So we believe that there's a combination of both, and that changes, of course, in every person in terms of what makes you, you. We also have recognized that there are stages of development, that people move through stages of development of critical things that are going on at certain times in their lives, and that those things have windows of opportunity. So your acquisition of language or your ability to walk, all those things happen at certain kind of predetermined times, and that human beings, animals in general, are going to be more successful if they're able to develop that particular skill within those critical time frames. And we also have the concept of stability versus change. So what makes the greater impact on a person? If they're stable, what happens when things change in their world around them? How does that impact them as well? So those are some things that we'll take a look at in developmental psychology, beginning with the very young stages, infancy. So what can infants do? What are their physical capacities? Well, they can do a lot. They are certainly helpless and need adults or older humans to care for them, but there's a lot of things that they can do that are just coded in when they're born. These are not learned responses. These are things that they just have deep down in the brain. They're based on the need to survive, and so they pop out and they're ready to be doing these things. A couple of them are to grasp. So here's a picture of a little tiny hand grabbing a thumb. Certainly if anybody's been around a baby, you know that they will grasp things, a hand or a toy or something. That's obviously a survival reflex. They need to be able to hold on and grab on. And then also to root, and that is that their mouth really is moving around, and obviously what they're doing is they're searching for lunch or for dinner. It's the ability to find and feed, and so the mouth is very, very active at that point. The average baby is about 7.5 pounds. Obviously, there's babies that are much bigger and babies that are much smaller, but that's kind of an average. And they grow very, very quickly after that. There's a lot of physical things that happen early. So within the first year, most babies, not all, but most babies are crawling somewhere around 8 to 10 months and walking pretty close to a year. So even though it is, human beings are very, very helpless compared to other animals early on, we develop those skills pretty quickly. One of the most important things that a child does in terms of being able to socialize and be part of the human social societies is to develop language. Language is the critical way that obviously we interact with each other. It's a critical way for us to get our point across. And without the ability to acquire language, the challenges are greater for most human beings. And so this is really a critical step in maturization for most of us. Most psychologists believe there is a critical learning period for language, that babies that are not exposed to language or that have some sort of an impairment, like a hearing impairment or a speech impairment, have a real hard time picking that up later on. And we'll talk about a case study related to that with a young lady named Jeannie in this unit who did not have the ability to pick up language and was very, very frustrated because of it. Baby talk. We think it's cute. We always, you go up to a little baby and you make all the little funny noises and things like that, but that's actually really critical stuff going on. Babies are trying to mimic what they hear. They're hearing sounds, they're hearing inflection, they're hearing voice tones, and they're trying to mimic it. They know something's going on there, something's important. They want to be part of that, and so the baby talk is really designed for them to take those first steps in utilizing the vocal cords to make noises like they hear around them. That really happens late in the first year. When we start to really move into language instead of noise is in the second year, and that's where we have sounds as symbols. So if you think about the words that I'm saying, think about those as verbal symbols. We know that this particular sound, this group of sounds, makes up a word, and that word has meaning. That's a symbol. So babies go from just making kind of random noises or trying to mimic the noises they hear to really coming up with some sounds that mean something. And that's when we start to move into language. At about 2 years old, the vocabulary is pretty limited. It's about 50 words, just enough to get by. By the time a child is 4 or 5, moving into that childhood phase, they have thousands of words at their command. And if psychologists, if people at schools see that a child doesn't have that kind of vocabulary, then there's a clue that there might be something wrong and we need to address that. So that's physical development and language development. Let's talk about cognitive development. And cognition, we're going to use this word a lot, so it's important that we know it, is the process of acquiring knowledge. So it's really gaining information. It's what do we do when we have all this information that's out there, and how do we try to parse it up and break it up and make it make sense to us. One of the very first psychologists who really studied the idea of the stages of development for children and how they develop in terms of their cognition was a guy named Jean Piaget. And he is pictured here. And Piaget is a very, very famous person to any educator because all teachers have gone through some sort of a child development class. And Piaget is a real famous thinker, not in terms of psychology alone, but also in terms of education. And so we'll talk about Piaget a lot. Piaget believed that there was something called schema that people went through, and that is that everybody, even they were very small and couldn't articulate this, had mental plans and an understanding of how the world works. Kind of, if you want to think about it, a set of rules, a rule book for how the world works, and that's called the schema. So as long as things worked within that box, worked within that set of rules, everybody was fine. When something works outside of that, then we have an issue because no longer are we on the plan. So we'll talk more about schema. One of the things that Piaget also noticed in very young children is the concept of object permanence. Object permanence is the idea that a child develops, and it takes a little while for them to figure this out, that things are still there even if they can't see them. And this is the classic game of peekaboo. When you play the game of peekaboo with a child, why they think it's so fascinating is because you're there 1 second and gone the next. And until they learn the concept of object permanence, they think you're gone. You don't exist in their world. So it's pretty funny when all of a sudden you pop back in. So children will acquire the concept that no, just because I can't see mom, she's around the corner in the kitchen, I know she's still there. I know she'll come back in a minute. And that's a critical step. And also a second one that happens later in life called the principle of conservation. And conservation is the idea that a similar amount of something may look different, but it's the same. So if you had a quart of water and you put it into one type of glass, it's still the same amount of water even if you put it into a different type of glass and it kind of looks different. So that's a critical skill that happens a little later in life called the principle of conservation. Let's take a look at a little bit more in depth about these stages of development. So you can see that we start off with something called sensory motor, and that really is that the infant from 0 to 2 years is really just trying to sense things, trying to touch, trying to feel, trying to taste any object. So anything that is happening in their life only exists when they can see it, touch it, feel it. And this is where they're starting to develop that object permanence that I talked about. Then they move from about 2 to 6 years or so into the pre-operational stage. And this is where the child is starting to use words. They're trying to understand that words are symbols. They can represent things, they can get points across, and they can communicate in that way. Children also begin to pretend. It's pretty important that they're starting to pretend. They might have an imaginary friend. They might start to play games that are pretend. But they are very egocentric, which means they're self-centered. They're centered on themselves. And not in a bad way like we think about that when we talk about an adult, but in terms of their whole existence is around them. They don't really see the concept that another person is important as well. When we move to about 7 to 12 years, so that late childhood, early adolescence, we move into the concrete operational stage. And this is where kids can start to think logically about things. And they understand the concept of conservation that I talked about before, that a similar size thing might look different, but it's the same thing. And then finally, from 12 years on to adulthood, we have formal operational stage. And that's where we can start to think abstractly and hypothetically, so we can actually think outside of our norm. We don't have to see it and touch it to understand it. We can think about it a little deeper. In terms of emotional development, what's going on? So we've talked about physical development, we've talked about cognitive development. Let's talk about emotional development, which is a critical stage for psychologists to think about. Well, very, very early on, there's a concept called imprinting, and there's a great picture here of a man being followed by a bunch of geese, it looks like. And that's the concept of imprinting, is that a baby, and it doesn't have to be human, it can be any kind of a species, we believe from very early on will connect with the people around it. And that is again, it's built in, it's something that's important for their survival, and it really does focus on the idea of I need to figure out who the caregiver in my world is, and I'm going to connect into them or imprint upon them and make sure that when I hear that voice, when I see that person, when I feel that touch, that I know that that's somebody who's important to me and I'm going to need them around. So that's the concept of imprinting. A critical time frame for that type of attachment with their caregivers is about 6 months to 3 years. This is where we're making some of those really critical connections. We have complete trust, obviously, during that time because we can't care for ourselves. We need somebody there, and the type of parent that is providing, or caregiver that's providing those supports at that point is really important. Also, early on, we have two concepts called separation and stranger anxiety. Separation anxiety is the idea that when the primary caregiver, and it's usually in history has been the mother, but it doesn't have to be, when that primary caregiver is away, there's a lot of anxiety and concern from the child that the most important person in their world has left. The same thing with stranger anxiety. When there's somebody new and they don't recognize that shape and that voice and that touch, that there's concerns about that too, and a child might cry a lot or be quite concerned. In terms of the attachment that they have, there's three main types. Secure attachment means that they recognize that their life works fairly well, and if their caregiver leaves for a moment, they're going to be okay when they come back. Avoidant and resistant attachment means there hasn't been a strong attachment made, and there's some concerns. Usually that leads to a child who is not as well connected with their parent. Let's talk a little bit about parenting. Obviously, parenting is critical for the development of a child, and the style of parenting is critical for how that child will develop. This is the primary caregiver. This is the primary center of love in the child's life, and so it makes sense that it would be very important. So in terms of styles of parents, let's talk a little bit about some of those that we might see. We have authoritarian parents. Authoritarian parents are the ones that say it's my way or the highway, this is what we do, this is my house, my rules, that kind of concept. And that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, it's just a way that says that the structure is that the parents expect the child to follow through with what they do, what they say, regardless of what the child would like to do. Democratic parents have more of a sharing of the ability to make decisions with the child. Well, what do you want to do today? Or what should we do for family night? Or those type of things. Where should we go to eat? And those have positives and negatives as well, to be a democratic parent. Permissive parents are parents that generally let the kids get away with whatever they want to do. You do what you want to do, I'm not going to worry about it. Or parents that want to be friends with their children. Parents that don't want to get into a conflict with their kids, and so are generally going to let them do what they want to do, and that can have some negative consequences. And then probably in terms of this list, the one that is the most devastating for a child to develop is the uninvolved parents, the parents that really don't are not there, or if they are even physically there, are not interested in the development of the child. It's kind of you're left to your own devices. And I'm not particularly concerned about you. And so those will all have different impacts in terms of how the child feels with their confidence, with their self-esteem, and all those type of things. Obviously, then we have child abuse, where children are being abused by, it could be their parents, it could be others in their social community. And child abuse, of course, comes in many, many different forms. We'll talk more about that as we go in this course. But that can lead in terms of developmental psychology to a number of long-standing issues that a person will suffer and deal with potentially for a good chunk of their life. Things like antisocial behavior, depression, and a loss of self-esteem. The last type of development we're going to talk about today is what's called moral development. Now, morals is the concept. The morality is the concept of, do you know what's right from wrong? So a moral person would be somebody who tends to know what's right and what's wrong and do the right thing. An immoral person would be one who knows what's right and wrong and does the wrong thing. And so the development of the concept of right and wrong is something that goes through stages as well. So let's talk a little bit about this. We have a pyramid here, and at the very bottom is the youngest age, and so we'll talk about that. And the very first thing that children do in terms of their moral development is that they recognize the things that they can and can't do related to punishment. So I know if I grab the candy, I'm going to get punished, so I won't do that. Or I know if I am out late at night, I'm going to get punished, so I'm not going to do that. That is a concept that is very self-centered. Self-interest is the same thing. What's in it for me? I'm going to do what makes it best for me. So if I can do this and I get something out of it, I'll do that. The good boy attitude, the next one is really trying to please. I want to please my caregiver. So it's not so much that I'm concerned about what's right and wrong on a grand scale. It's just that I want to do what makes my parents or my caregivers like me. The next one is law and order morality, and this is kind of interesting. This is where we go into a phase of fair, and you can probably think about this in terms of yourself or maybe somebody else, a young child that you know, where it's not fair. That concept is when they have reached the law and order morality stage, that they're starting to see that there are some built-in breakdowns in terms of fairness and equity, and that frustrates a child. I'm only willing to do it if it's fair. Social contract is the concept that we start to see when we get into adolescence and then young adulthood, that morals are important for society to work. So if we don't do what's right and wrong, the whole system breaks down. If everybody went in and stole a TV, pretty soon we wouldn't have any kind of a system. If everybody decided that they got mad at somebody and bopped them over the head, then we don't have a system. And so it's important for for society to function for morality. And then finally, the top end of the moral pyramid is principle. And then you're doing things based on what truly is right and wrong. It's not because I can get something out of it. It's not because I want something. It's not because it's fair. It's not because it's good for society. It's just simply on principle. I'm not going to do this, or I will do this because it's the right thing to do. And that's when a person has reached the top end of moral development. Okay, so a lot of information here. This is really fascinating stuff. I love child development. Anybody that's interested in education down the road, you'll learn a lot about this stuff in your education courses in college. Take a look at the chapter. We're looking at chapter 3 this time. It's linked up on your assignment, and then go ahead and work through the rest of the lesson. And we'll talk to you next time.